So, when we think of modern drone warfare, we usually picture these cold, perfectly calculating machines, right? But the reality is actually way more complex, and it all entirely revolves around the human being sitting right there behind the screens.
Okay, let's dive right in and challenge a super common myth. You know the one. The idea that operating a drone from a perfectly safe base, literally thousands of miles away, is just this emotionally detached, purely rational experience. Basically, that it's just like playing a video game. It's incredibly easy to assume that the operator is out of physical danger, the psychological and cognitive pressures must just be non existent. But as we're going to see from the research today, that couldn't be further from the truth. The harsh reality, straight from the source material, is this. These operators might be physically safe, but mentally, they are deployed on a high-definition battlefield experiencing very real trauma. Their digital feeds provide this direct, unblinking window right into combat. They track targets, witness collateral damage, and observe the immediate aftermath of strikes. The physical distance between them and the target is vast, but the psychological distance is effectively zero. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to completely shatter this detached operator myth by looking at 1. The human in the loop, 2. The psychological toll, 3. The risk factors, 4. The illusion of control, 5. The hot hand fallacy, and finally, 6. The modern operator paradox.
Starting off with Section 1, the human in the loop. To really grasp what these individuals are going through, we have to look at their completely unprecedented working conditions. Operators provide real-time intelligence and precision strike capabilities, which creates this bizarre psychological paradox. They are continually deployed in garrison, meaning they are actually stationed at their home base, with absolutely no definitive boundaries to the deployed experience. Just imagine driving to a totally normal suburban office park, stepping into a dark room, and suddenly you are actively participating in a war zone. Then, at the end of a 10 or 12-hour shift, you literally drive back home to have dinner with your family. There's no physical transition, no deployment away from home. It's just an abrupt, daily switch between normal domestic civilian life and hyper-vigilant combat operations.
Moving on to Section 2, the psychological toll. That relentless pace absolutely leaves a mark. Out of the 1,084 U.S. Air Force drone operators surveyed in our source material, 4.3% met the criteria for moderate to extreme post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I know that single digit might seem a bit small at first glance, but it represents a highly significant subset of a workforce dealing with severe emotional distress. And it's distress that fundamentally challenges our assumptions about the safety of remote warfare. To really put that into perspective, this trauma sits right in the middle of the spectrum. Yes, it's lower than the 10 to 18% rate we see in combat deployed ground troops, but that 4.3% completely towers over the less than 1% baseline found in the general Air Force population's medical records. It proves, without a doubt, that virtual exposure to combat creates a highly specific, measurable level of psychological harm.
Which brings us to Section 3, the risk factors. So, what exactly is it about the daily grind of this job that pushes that PTSD rate up? We're not just looking at abstract numbers here. These represent exhausted airmen dealing with severe sleep disturbance and avoidance behaviors, largely caused by relentless 50-plus hour weeks and long-term assignments. Check this out. If an operator works more than 51 hours a week, their risk of PTSD jumps by 2.36 times. If they're stationed in this specific role for more than 25 months, the risk is 2.63 times higher. And the most common symptom across the board? Trouble falling or staying asleep. Nearly 90% of those meeting PTSD criteria struggle to sleep, which, as we all know, severely degrades memory, attention, and decision-making capabilities. And those are skills that are absolutely vital when you're operating armed aircraft.
Let's pivot to Section 4, the illusion of control. We've seen how the environment affects their mental health, but how does the human brain process the actual rational task of piloting these insanely complex systems? Well, in cyber-physical systems, humans are not perfectly rational algorithms. We are bounded. This concept of bounded rationality means we have limited cognitive capabilities, making us prone to overconfidence and vastly underestimating systemic risks. Traditional economic and engineering models love to pretend that humans will always calculate the most optimal, mathematically perfect choice. But behavioral economics tells us otherwise. We rely on mental shortcuts, or heuristics. While these shortcuts are great for navigating everyday life, they can introduce massive blind spots when we're in the pilot seat of a multi-million-dollar drone.
To test this bounded rationality, researchers set up a really clever experimental framework. Subjects piloted a simulated UAV over 10 traffic junctions to gather information, all while managing a constant 2% crash risk. In this experiment, the human operator's goal is simple: gain as much valuable photographic intelligence as possible. But here's the catch. Every single time they choose to circle back and take another picture, they face a 2% chance that the drone will crash, which costs them everything they've earned for that specific mission. So, the operators had to figure out a sequential stopping rule. They're trying to maximize their profit without losing the drone, which requires them to calculate complex probabilities totally on the fly. Think about it. The first picture of a traffic junction is incredibly valuable. The second is helpful, but kinda less so. By the fifth or sixth picture, the new information you're gaining is practically zero. Yet, that 2% crash risk remains exactly the same. A perfectly rational computer would easily calculate the exact moment the risk outweighs the reward and just move on. But for a human operator making this call repeatedly under pressure, can they really make the perfect mathematical call every single time?
That leads us to Section 5, the hot hand fallacy. Okay, the hot hand fallacy. It's exactly like a basketball player on a wild scoring streak. Drone pilots who experience immediate success begin to feel like they're just on a roll. Even though every single flight round carries a completely independent 2% risk of a crash, operators who successfully fly multiple rounds without an incident start to subconsciously believe their odds are actually improving. They attribute the drone surviving not to basic probability and luck, but to their own perceived skill and control. And this reveals a truly fascinating paradox. You'd think giving human operators more immediate feedback would make them better, right? It actually causes them to act inefficiently by flying too much and exposing themselves to totally unnecessary risks. In computer engineering, more data and faster feedback almost always equals better performance. But in this human-in-the-loop experiment, when subjects received constant positive feedback that their photos were successful, they became dangerously overconfident. The hot hand fallacy completely took over. They ignored the diminishing returns, ignored that static 2% crash risk, and just kept flying, pushing the drone far past the mathematical breaking point simply because they felt they couldn't lose.
Finally, Section 6, the modern operator paradox.
When we take a step back and look at both halves of this equation, whether it's facing the emotional devastation of PTSD from a PAR or compromising operations through cognitive errors like the hot hand fallacy, one thing is incredibly clear. The human in the loop remains our most complex and ultimately our most vulnerable component. We design these incredibly sophisticated machines to keep operators physically safe, but we absolutely cannot engineer the humanity out of the pilot. They still process trauma, they still desperately need sleep, and they still fall victim to overconfidence when they feel they're on a winning streak. So as we continue to build the future of automated and remote systems, it leaves us with a massive question. Are we designing systems for the perfectly rational operators we wish we had? Or are we actually designing them to protect and support the beautifully flawed human beings sitting right there behind the screen?